Welcome to a brand new episode of Zeroing In, the Science Podcast, delving deeper into the inner functionings of a city and how our everydays seem so immaculately shaped in that context. We are in conversation today with an expert in the field of urban planning and transport planning, Professor Geetam Tiwari, whose research work deals with the complex questions that address the development and evolution, much like an organism, of modern cityscapes and urban human settlements. Professor Tiwari completed her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Roorkee and then went on to pursue Master of Urban Planning and Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She continued there for her PhD in public policy analysis with the specialization in transport planning as well. She joined the Civil Engineering Department at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi in 1990, where she currently is the Trip Chair Professor. Her areas of research and work that have impacted the current cities very directly span across the wide areas of transport planning and modeling, traffic engineering, planning of public transport systems, urban planning, and urban traffic safety, to name a few major themes that her projects very adroitly address. Her extremely rich experiences across different continents and brilliant insights amalgamate beautifully to give way to the new understandings that we had the fortune of discussing with her over an illuminating conversation, while probing more into the process of the making of a city with the fourth season of Zeroing In. In conversation with Professor Tiwari for this episode, we have Reshma Khan, who pursued her master's in urban planning and currently is working as an assistant engineer in the public works department in the government of Rajasthan and deals with a very similar field on a day to day basis as well. I am Naman Jain, and this is Zeroing In, the science podcast. I think we'd like to start the discussion by delving into how do cities really form, or how does a city take shape, looking at it from a perfectly theoretical perspective. Are there any such, or are there any fundamental whys about why urban societies are formed, and at what point does this community adapt to or develop a physical structure that we call a city today? How do we define this?
Yeah, I mean, historically, if you see, uh, when people move from agrarian societies to more non agricultural kind of work dependence, then there is a need to stay closer together. Because in when societies were more dependent on agriculture or hunting, even before that, then you're looking at more sprawl and low densities and people needing a lot of land. But when there is more surplus and people started doing other non-agricultural kind of work, there is a need to stay closer together. So very, very early on, you see how the dwelling densities start increasing. I would say that is the beginning of urban areas or urban societies. More dependence on non-agricultural work, and that also leads to changes of structures, how people are living and organizing themselves in physical spaces. So that is the beginning. And then very early on, you see, one very essential thing is that people are moving about. You have to go from point A to point B, because many things that we want to do is not available at the same space or same time. So mobility becomes a very essential ingredient in developing a city or urban area, and how people move then starts influencing how cities start growing. The skeletal of that city is based on the networks which are there for serving our mobility needs. And as long as it's more pedestrian oriented, more walking, it's very different. But in the last 200 years, we start seeing something very different. And that's where I think a lot of challenges to modern urban mobility comes into being. Because the kind of speeds that we see, I mean, human beings never experienced this before 200 years ago, when there was no motorized vehicle, when there was no IC engine. So with the advent of IC engine, it has had a major influence on how people move, and in turn having an impact on how cities start growing and how networks start growing, and around that then we start seeing the changes in the landscape. How, what kind of buildings are coming up, what kind of land use patterns are coming up, and what technologies start dominating, etc. So I would say, you know, it's all about really more non-agricultural work, and slowly more and more dependence on IC engines, motorized mobility.
Uh-huh. But this is in very stark contrast, right? I mean, when we try to like understand these extremely fundamental or ancient civilizations, maybe starting from like the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilizations, we say that those cities were planned too. So, I mean, does the definition of planning per se change when we really talk about the planning that is done in the current cities and the olden civilizations, or how do we really adapt to this, or how does the time difference sort of play a role in this?
My understanding, it's not, I mean, every bit of a city is planned. We can say whether it is planned by an expert, or is it planned, or it's self organized. And
Uh-huh.
in lot of places we see self organized systems, and especially in many earlier cities, and I would say even in current Asian African societies, where we have a lot of self organizing cities. So I would not say it is unplanned, it is planned, but by for meeting different needs, and it's self organized, and a lot of times it gets dominated by survival compulsions. So a lot of the way people plan themselves, how they are living, how they are moving, is trying to meet their basic fundamental needs. So I would say yes, we always start with that, Indus Valley Harappan civilization was a planned city, because we end up seeing a gridiron pattern there. Streets were very straight. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if the streets are not straight, it is unplanned. It is
Uh-huh.
still planned by different people, and that happens in every civilization. You look at Chinese, you look at Egyptian, wherever people have congregated, when they start moving away from agrarian societies, and we start seeing, that many dwelling units are coming together, and then it just doesn't remain only dwelling units. You also find we do need commercial areas. People need to buy things, so shops start coming up, and then much later on, and many places you find that how these cities start getting organized around churches or around temples. So
Uh-huh.
that we find many instances in India also, that we have these concentric rings. The center is a temple, but around that, how more powerful people are living, and then another ring where more business people are living, people who are supplying goods, and then another ring where people are living, where who are the workers, so to say, to keep the city going. So different versions of this you find in many different societies. You
Uh-huh.
find similar things happening in China. You find any old civilization you take. But I think the challenges that we face today in 21st century is has not been, it's quite unprecedented. And we, I mean, after 2000, more than 50% of the population now lives in cities, in a very formal definition of urban area, where majority people are employed in non-agricultural work, densities are high, and more people are involved in service sector, not even manufacturing. So, and with current understanding of global challenges that we look at, which we did not have in last century. We had no understanding of climate change. uh, we did not talk about sustainability the way we talk today. So I think today we have to really understand planning cities, and planning mobility in a very different way, much more challenging.
Since you just mentioned about importance of mobility in cities, I would like to ask you that from a theoretical perspective, what are the different demographic studies or traffic related studies that goes in planning a city?
So, I mean, if you see the way modern planning, conventional planning has happened, not only in India. I mean, it basically started in Europe and North America. It is very car centric. I mean, the way it is hugely influenced by. I'm not talking about urban planning now, more of transport planning. Hugely influenced after the advent of IC engines and cars. And that's when people start worrying that how are we going to accommodate this mode of transport within our city. And so our studies, traffic studies, get start getting influenced by that. And even the kind of traffic models, the planning models that we make for transport planning is influenced by that. So very traditionally, every transport planner is taught the traditional four-step model, what is called. That understand how many trips are being generated, see where the trips are going, where people are going to, and then based on that decide. People do make a choices of how they are going to travel. Are they going to use car or public transport or any other mode of transport? And then finally see that which routes people choose, and you come up with a network assignment or network models for any city. So for these kind of study, this is the kind of pattern which continues to dominate today also. And at one level it is worrisome, because this becomes actually very car centric. This worked well in the last century, when we did not have any understanding of global challenges, climate change, other resource constraint, a lot of negative adverse effects of motorization. We didn't have that understanding in the last century. So, however, in the current century, we do understand that. And yet, if our experts continue to use the same methodology, which we do, count number of cars, count number of people, how they are traveling, and then based on that forecast, you take up any city in India also, how it is being planned. We just see that the roads are full of cars and cars are getting delayed. So only thing you need to do is basically you count number of cars and say it's going to increase in future, because our incomes are increasing, there'll be more motorization. Let's make more car lanes. Let's make more elevated roads. And that's completely a negative feedback, because that keeps feeding into that unending spiral. We don't solve the congestion problem, but we do create problems for future generations by doing this.
Uh-huh.
So, to answer your short question, that what kind of studies, it is getting dominated, it continues to be dominated by um, looking into motorized modes of transport.
That is, in fact, we also do while we model ourselves. Actually, this brings me to another question, ma'am. Do these models take into account alternate modes of transportation, such as walking?
I mean, unfortunately, what happens that, I mean, as traffic engineers, we also know, we do see that there are other modes of transport. People are walking, using bicycle, using public transport. But what do we do in our engineering studies? We convert all different vehicles to equivalent passenger car. You remember the unit we use to describe capacity of a road is PCU, passenger car unit. So the moment you convert a two-wheeler or a bicycle to a passenger car unit, then your focus is to meet the demands of a car, not
Uh-huh.
really the details or the intricacies which are required to make a bicycle more attractive or walking more attractive. And I would say even public transport, because every public transport trip also involves walking trip. How do you reach a public transport stop? You can't reach there without walking. Maybe for 50 meters, or it could be for 500 meters. But in this kind of methodologies that we have been conventionally we have uh, used, all these details get hidden and forgotten. Since 2016 there has been a lot of discussion, and the United Nations came up with sustainable development goals. The 17 sustainable development goals, which have been accepted by most countries in the world, at least 7 of them are directly related to mobility. And one of them, so two of them, very important goals. 11.6 talks about that a quality public transport system should be within 500 meters of every citizen. So if you want to make this, and that is where the cities have to work towards, the planners have to ensure that this is what is going to happen, that and that 500 meters should be safe and accessible and inclusive, because it must meet the needs of people with various challenges, people with visual impairment or physical disability, etc. It has to meet those requirements also. So it is true that today that may not be the case. The organized public transport may not be there, and that is what we want to achieve. However, very interesting thing in India happens, because if you see, in most of our cities, our car ownership is very low. Even today, even in Delhi, not more than 15-20% households own cars. So then you wonder, how do other people travel? They are traveling by other modes of transport, including public transport. And in small cities, these numbers are much higher. People depending on walking and bicycle and public transport is much higher. So there, actually, people are not traveling long distances, and the informal public transport is actually very much close to where most people live. So, what is informal public transport? These are your three wheelers, various forms of three wheelers, because this is not organized system like your bus system or metro, but it's a shared system. And this has evolved because there is a need for it. So that is what I was alluding to earlier also, that in most places we find that these if there is a need for certain thing, there is self organization. So there is a demand for this kind of mobility. So people come up with these options, and it may not be the most optimal option always. So much more interventions are required to make it more sustainable, safe, reliable, etc. But it does provide those short distances. People can walk to, people can get a three-wheeler very close to where they live.
Interesting. Before we jump into the technical details again, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, when or where did you get really interested in the idea of studying something like this? And how did that come about? I mean, personally, when did you find yourself being interested in this discipline so deeply?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interdisciplinary topic. So basically, my undergraduate degree is in architecture.
Yeah.
So I completed architecture, but from I would say fourth year onwards, I was getting more and more interested in planning. And architecture and regional and city plannings are very related topics. Lot of architects branch into that for masters. So that was my original idea, to focus more on planning, because I used to find, actually, designing a building is very interesting. It's all about visualizing spaces. But what I was feeling uncomfortable with, that, you are designing for a client, and many times, this is not the best design. You could come up with a better option, but there are time constraints. So it's, and most people don't understand two-dimensional drawings, or for that matter, even three-dimensional. And it's the way you convince. It's very easy to convince people that this is the best design. Whereas in my heart, I knew this is not the best design. So I was not comfortable with that. So after working for 1 year as an architect, then I decided to just go and specialize in planning, and I went to US for that. So I was in Penn State for one semester doing regional planning. And then very quickly I got interested more in transport planning. So I shifted to Chicago, which is, like a big, huge major city. and lot of original transport planning concepts and methodologies have evolved in places like Chicago, which were heavily dominated by car traffic and lot of people working to solve these problems. So from architecture, that's how I moved to transport planning.
Uh-huh.
But after PhD, when I returned to India, and then you start, I mean, your theory still works. You know, the technical part that you learn is always valid. But then when you look around and apply those first principles to things that are happening around you, that's what starts giving you a lot of interesting insights which you don't find in the books. So that's how I actually started, looking into more into then how people are moving about. What is this whole idea of shared spaces that we have in our cities?
Uh-huh.
And we make our roads for motorized traffic, but it is used by all. We don't really plan spaces for pedestrians or bicycles, and even for public transport, because that need is also different. But we do have many people using these modes. Why does it happen? Because these are the people who have no choices. They are captive users. So even when the environment is very hostile, since they don't have any choice, they would continue to walk and use bicycle and use public transport. But the challenge is that we want to make these modes choice modes. I think that's where the major challenges start coming. Because the moment you want to give priority to pedestrians, bicycles, public transport, it is in direct conflict with private car users, which are in minority, but the powerful minority. So I think some of these things we have to face these challenges.
Huh. But I also want to ask, because interestingly, the fundamentally relevant ideas or the whole discipline of transport and urban planning sort of seems like it should be impacted by the environment, right? Or the relevance in the surrounding geographical location or the country, like the fields of science and technology, like all fields of science and technology, I believe. So, for instance, when you studied in India and then when you went on to pursue this further in the US and so on, what the challenges and the pedagogical ideas were they also really different?
Absolutely, no, you are absolutely right. I mean, if I had stayed back in US, I would have looked at different problems.
Uh-huh.
But the techniques remain the same.
Uh-huh.
Because then you are trying to understand the relationship between how people behave and how technologies and other policies are having an impact on it. So very simple transport model is that we say it is an interaction, just like in microeconomics you have an interaction between demand and supply, right? And that is what leads to an equilibrium. So similar analogies have been used for transport system to understand that there is what we call an activity system. Now, activity system is what creates demand. So it's socio-economic, demographics, land use patterns, how cities have evolved. That creates the demand to travel. And that will also determine how people will travel. Do they have access to motorized modes, or are they dependent on public transport, etc.? And the other subsystem, what we call service or supply system, really is what kind of infrastructure we have to meet these demands. So, networks, technologies, regulations, policies, and politics of it. Because actually, it's not just technical part; it is very much the politics of mobility is embedded in it. Because whether we give a bus system, a free bus system or not, is a political decision. It's
Yeah.
not a technical decision, but it will have influence on the demand. So it's the interaction of these two now. Your service system, both
Yeah.
hard and soft together, and the activity system together, that creates what we see on our roads. So the techniques remain the same. Maybe in US we would have looked at different things. People, I mean, there the sprawl is a huge issue now, and lifestyle. People are so dependent on motorized modes of transport. Every third US citizen is an obese person. So there are a lot of health issues there. So one has to look at very different how to reduce dependence on fossil fuel, etc. But our challenges are, I think, we still have opportunity to make our cities much more friendly, much more sustainable as compared to many of the North American cities. Because in some senses we have mega cities, but they are not sprawl in the sense that people are not more majority people are not traveling long distances. But we are going to lose this if we continue with the kind of investments that are happening today. So we have to that's I think that's the huge challenge we have to deal with. If we do understand these things, how do we make use of this opportunity and arrest this negative development?
It's quite interesting to hear how the fundamentals remain the same across the globe. I would now like to focus on some aspects of city planning in India. We see many cities being planned on transit oriented development, that is TOD. Can you tell us more about TODs and whether these developments include bicycles and other modes of transportation?
Yeah, so this whole concept of transit oriented cities again evolved, originally came out from US, because there you have a lot of sprawl. So the whole idea was that introduce a quality transit system, a metro like system, LRT or MRT. And these systems are very high capacity systems, so you have to have high density developments around it so that a lot of people can start using it, and you can utilize the capacity provided by these systems. And so the whole idea of transit oriented development is that you make high density developments near the quality public transport system, so more people start using these public transport systems. Another feature of it is that it's not just about residential areas, it should be mixed land use patterns, right? Otherwise, if we give high quality public transport system like metro, it enables you to travel faster, longer distances very conveniently. So instead of densification, it actually leads to sprawl. It's easy for people to live far away and then commute to central cities only for work and then go back. So they are still doing long commute. But the idea of TOD was to have mixed land use patterns, high density developments, and encourage more people using public transport. Now, I think the challenge I see in India, the way it's been happening, so few places which have developed, say in Delhi, around metro system, around metro stops, the land use patterns have been allowed to change. We have more high-rise, mixed land use, high-rise densities, and very very high residential densities. But if we make a lot of parking spaces in these development, and for the residential areas for very high end consumers, luxury apartments, we don't expect them to use public transport. And even if it's close to public transport, they are not likely to use public transport. So I think we have to, in our context, still think about TOD in a different way. And why are we restricting only to metro? Why not have good a bus system, and we can have medium density developments around bus networks also, because buses, quality buses, are also providing you very good access. And that would be much, and bus networks are always much more spread out, because we don't need that kind of capital intensive investment as required for metro. So every arterial road you can make, major arterial road can become bus friendly, and we can have, let's call it, TOD. And I think we should also look at what I could call POD, pedestrian oriented development, and bicycle oriented development, because there is a lot of scope for that. And given the current understanding of health benefits of these modes, I think that is where our plans should focus.
That is definitely quite enlightening to hear, ma'am. One thing that I would like to take from our conversation so far is how public transportation system play a major role in city planning. In particular, I would like to ask you about the implementation of BRT system in place in many cities. Are there fundamental similarities or differences that we see in the BRT network in the earliest implementation, such as in Bogota, and their counterparts in Indian cities such as Delhi?
So you have to actually start from very fundamental, that Bogota was not the only place where priority is given to buses. In fact, it started much before that. And there have been two kinds of developments in the world as far as giving priority to buses are concerned. One set of experts they started working in Asian cities, and the early application we find in Taiwan, where already they had a very good bus system, but they wanted, to improve it further. So it was upgrading an existing bus system to a better bus system, is the concept which evolved in Taiwan, Korea, and many other parts of China. But around the same time, I mean, earliest example we find actually in Curitiba, not in Bogota, in
Okay.
1975. So Curitiba wanted to implement a metro system, and that mayor was an architect. So he looked at all the calculations and he said, "We can't afford metro system because and this is when their per capita income was already much higher than India." So they said, "We can't afford metro system. We will, draining out all our budgets. So let's see, can we implement metro on surface?" So in Latin American cities, the concept evolved, not bus but metro on surface concept as a bus system. So Curitiba was the first city to implement these exclusive bus lanes. They called it uh, bus rapid transit system, and evolution that evolved in many other Sao Paulo, many other cities in Latin America, and finally 1997-98 in Bogota, Transmillennia. So Transmillennia happened much later.
Okay.
So you see, there are these two concepts which come for upgrading bus systems. So the difference between the two concepts is that when Asian cities are talking about upgrading bus system, they are talking about what is called open system, which means you have the advantage of bus system is that it has great network connectivity, because buses can go on any road, right? That is how it happens today. And how it evolved in Taiwan also, that when buses are getting stuck in congestion, they said, okay, let us solve this problem. Why are buses getting stuck in congestion? So keep the buses out of congestion, bring them to a separate lane, see what can be done. And again, improving a bus system is not about moving a vehicle, it is about how you have an impact on a person's journey from home to final destination. So how do you get to a bus stop? That should be the easiest, shortest distance and safe. Then how do you the bus is moving in an exclusive lane, it doesn't get stuck in congestion. If there is an intersection, can we give priority on intersection to move the bus quickly? And then how does the bus move? Every time you stop the bus, uh, the speed is dependent on the frequency of stops.
Yeah.
So if you can rationalize that, you can improve the speed.
Yeah.
These concepts were embedded in Taiwan system, Korean system, and many Chinese systems. This is called open BRT system. So and Bogota system, Transmillennia system, Curitiba was make a metro-like system on surface, complete exclusivity. Those vehicles do not leave the lanes at all. And just like in metro system, you have once you get into the platform, you have already bought the ticket, you just board it, and there is no other interference, and you reach your final destination. This concept was implemented in Latin America. So what happened in Delhi? When we started working very early 90s, So first thing, we started understanding that mixed traffic, all roads are mixed traffic. There is not a single road, even in today in Delhi, where you do not have a few bicycles, rickshaws, thelas, etc. So mixing of slow and fast vehicle does create lot of friction and suboptimal conditions for all. So first concept is, if we want to improve movement of our roads, we have to segregate, at least from main roads, high speed traffic with low speed traffic. So not only low speed traffic becomes safer, but for high speed traffic it becomes easier to move. So this was the first concept. It wasn't about buses. It was about, let's give safe spaces to bicycles and pedestrians. Next is that in Delhi, even today, 25% people move in buses. And at that time, in 90s, it was 40%. So if 40% trips are on buses, should we not give priority to buses? If we are, and the whole idea is that if you make it so attractive, like Bogota, what is Bogota? More reliable,
Yeah.
right? If you give that kind of system, maybe more people will start using buses. So low ridership was never an issue in India. Even today, buses are full. The point is that instead of crowded, motorized, single people sitting in cars, if you want to utilize your spaces better, you have to run more buses, and more comfortable buses and more reliable buses. So this is how then it evolves in India. Of course, we were in touch with Bogota. We were discussing things with Mr. Enrique Penelosa, also Curitiba, then other experts from China, Jason Chang. So we were interacting with all these people, and it was clear that given our mixed traffic, where we have lot of people walking, bicycling, motorized two wheelers, we should go, and we already have established bus system. Networks are good, so we should go for something like what Taiwan was doing or what Korea was doing. We shouldn't try to imitate a very closed system, because that makes it more flexible. So places where you have space, that is the place where we can give one lane to buses, and the narrow roads, buses can leave and go in the mixed traffic and come back and join these. So it was that kind of flexibility which was planned for Delhi. Any public transport system has to be planned as a system, which basically means that you look at how you reach a bus stop, how you wait at a bus stop, and then how you move in a vehicle, and then same egress at the other end. Unless you look at this whole thing, you won't be solving problem for public transport users.
That was definitely a very detailed evaluation of the BRT systems and was certainly very enlightening. In light of public transport, one thing that you just mentioned is to look at how people reach the public transport systems. I would like to ask you, as a planner, would you prefer a system which brings public transport closer to residential areas or making it more pedestrian friendly? Or would a system with intermediate transport system be a more viable option?
It should not be a priority either or decision, because there is always mix of people, that is the I think that's the fascination, and that's also the challenge of mobility, that some people would be willing to bicycle, but we can't expect 100% people population to bicycle. So, and then there are certain needs, people, older people, people with some kind of disability, or you have to go to a hospital, you may not be able to use bicycle. So there is always, you have to give options to people. So I think a good, strong, I would say, because roads are everywhere, so our first priority should be bus, road-based public transport system. For long distances, metro systems are excellent, so that should become complementary. And then access to this comes by combining walking, bicycling, and all other modes of transport. So I think it is basically, I would say 100% of the city has to be pedestrian and bicycle friendly. and then certain roads become more public transport friendly, and the remaining is given to personal mobility. We will still have people using cars. It's not that people will stop using cars. But it's just that in peak hours, the systems should be such that even car owning population should find public transport more attractive. In non peak hours, use your car and go wherever you want to.
But given this whole idea, I mean, given that it's a scientific field and so on, and then also there comes the idea that the whole experience is user centric. So how do you sort of generate strategies or kind of quantify this at the end of I don't know, while planning, for instance? I mean, are there reliable models on this, or is there something else that you have to worry about this each time in a different way?
No, the model, the actually now more and more experts are relying on what is called backcasting model. Don't try to forecast. We have a vision of a city. We know our future constraints. Based on that, we have a vision. In 2030, how should people be moving? And
Uh-huh.
from there, you backcast. Now, if we do want dependence on public transport, what is required? And in small bits, start introducing that so that it becomes more slowly more acceptable. I think that's the methodology which is being um, uh, propagated now. Instead of the old forecasting methodology, observe and forecast.
Uh-huh.
Instead of that, do backcasting.
Interesting. And then just zooming out a bit, and probably just asking if there are any interesting models that you find across like the world in general about the ideas that we're talking about, right? About the general mobility in a city. Are there anything? Is there anything that kind of fascinates you from the models that you've studied over the like across the models that you've kind of studied across the world, or the modes of transport and so on? Or is there something that you find like peculiarly intriguing in that sense?
I mean, modes of transport more or less remain the same, but I think some interesting developments have occurred. For example, if you see in Seoul in 2005, there was, so in 80s there used to be a small river running through the city, and like any other city, fast developing city, they needed more roads. Engineers wanted to make elevated roads, so they covered the rivulet and made an elevated road on top of that. 20
Uh-huh.
years later, when they went to the mayor that even concrete structures need maintenance, and they needed a lot of money to repair it. So again, that was one of those decisions. The mayor actually decided that he questioned them. He said, "Why do you need an elevated road running in the city, in the middle of the city? All elevated roads create a lot of negative spaces." And the engineers were quite horrified, but over 1 year, they had several meetings with all stakeholders, people living next to it, and finally, they decided that they should remove the elevated road. And then they bombarded the elevated road. They removed it. They restored the river. And on both sides of the restored river, they have made beautiful paths, walking, bicycling, and the road, the motorized road is reserved for public transport. So I find this fascinating that it's not that the concepts that people talk about, it's just in theory. Some people have been able to actually do it and demonstrate. So of course you question what happened to all those cars which were using those, the elevated structure, and all
Yeah.
the forecasts were that there will be more cars. What happened to that?
Yeah.
So the answer is very interesting. You go and see, if you change the structure, people change their travel behavior. So either many of them have changed the route, or because it's become so convenient to travel by public transport or walking and bicycling, they change the mode of travel. So
Wow.
travel behavior is not given. That is why forecasting is a bad idea. You can influence travel behavior by changing the structures. It may take time, but it does happen. So this is quite fascinating.
Indeed, that's quite fascinating to learn from you how the cities actually shape and how the day-to-day movements influence the transport planning and vice versa. It was really, really interesting and definitely quite enlightening. I'd like to ask you one more question, one last question before we close the session, I believe. That a lot of your recent work actually relates to the idea of sustainable development of cities, or that's what it proposes and sort of lines along. So, can I ask, how do you really define the sustainability in terms of a city development and transport? And how do you really see the field evolve?
Sustainable cities means that, all the, I mean, very traditionally we are saying uh, the resources that we are using, we should use in such a way that, we don't we don't deprive future generations from that. But now make this vision or concept more operational in terms of city planning and in terms of transport planning. And then we start seeing that, if we want less resource consumption of all non-renewable sources, we have to depend more on public transport systems. We have to depend more on walking and bicycling. And as I mentioned earlier, already majority of Indian cities do have this pattern. The
Mhm,
challenge is that this is not by choice.
mhm,
So I think the first challenge that we have to meet it, that plan our systems, both city and transport is a subsystem of that, in such a way that walking, bicycling, and using public transport becomes a matter of choice.
mhm,
I may own a car, but I find it much easier to use a public transport or walk to a nearby shopping. That's the first thing. That is my concept of sustainability. Where are we in terms of this? I think we are not doing well at all, because not by formal planning. Very little we have done in terms of formal planning. And in last few years, this whole smart city debate has kind of uh, not really talked about this kind of sustainability. If I step out of my house and I'm not able to walk safely and comfortably, why should I walk? So that is losing sustainability. And it is not just about resource consumption. Remember, sustainability has a lot to do with especially sustainable mobility has a lot to do with public health. Lack of active transport is being linked to a large number of cardiovascular diseases, cerebrovascular diseases, diabetes, hypertension, all kinds of things. So people in today in Indian cities are walking, they are breathing polluted air. They may have some benefit because they are walking. On the other hand, people who are not walking are facing these other health challenges. So I think that I mean, our whole investment and planning priority has to change if we want to meet the sustainability. One interesting thing, in this whole sustainability debate, and today, I mean, for India also, it's very relevant that nearly more than 150,000 people die on our streets every year in India. And a majority of them are pedestrians and motorized two wheelers and bicyclists. So it's making cities still car friendly uh, is one of the reasons for that. But if you talk in general or read many times in the media, the whole discussion seems to be that Indians are indisciplined. We don't know how to behave on the road. That's not true at all. Indians are just like any other people. Our behavior is reflecting the kind of environment that we have to operate in. So if we are on the road and there is no pedestrian light, and as a pedestrian, you are expected to wait for a long time, you will not wait. That's human behavior. It's not Indian behavior. That will anywhere in the globe. So I think this aspect we really have to understand. That first we make motorized vehicles our priority, and then for all these negative aspects, we start blaming the most vulnerable groups. It's the lack of poor infrastructure and lack of understanding of how people behave on the road. So that part also becomes a very much part of our sustainable mobility and sustainable how we design our cities. If you make a foot over bridge as a young person, would you rather use a foot over bridge or run across the road? Run across the road because it's much faster. But we keep making foot over bridges, and we are also giving a message to people: if you own a car, you have the right of way. So there are these lot of these subliminal messages which we are giving by the way we design our infrastructure and policies, and that influences our behavior. I wish more architects and planners got involved in making roads because they are more sensitive to these issues. The civil engineers or engineers, we tend to, we want one final answer. We are not very good with certainties. It's not about technical solution. It's also about muddling through all the politics of it and convincing various stakeholders and being sensitive to needs of the most vulnerable.
Aha, wow. These ideas are just so interesting to finally come across in the clearest ways through these perspectives that you shared in the most straightforward words. Which, of course, not each road and foot over bridge and the plethora of infrastructures, it would never be possible to be able to hold these words, right? But the amount of genius that goes behind the planning and implementation, among all of the labors of brain and pain, it's quite remarkable how to plain sight it just can seem effortless. I mean, it does to us every day. So thank you so much for being so patient with us and sharing these viewpoints for us to nurture better choices in the future.
No, it was a pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
This was a conversation from the fourth season of Zeroing In, the science podcast, where we're exploring the foundations of how cities were found, formed, and developed over the centuries. And we're touching along some of the really interesting regimes that we can over the season. We extend our sincerest gratitude to Professor Geetam Tiwari for this lovely discussion and the patient string of sublime ideas, lending us marvelous perspectives on how an everyday city is embellished with intricately woven ideas and understandings of humans. On behalf of the whole Zeroing In team for this episode, which included Reshma Khan, Muniba Rizvi, Jayadeep, Aditya Krishna, along with the season team for Zeroing In, and I am Naman Jain. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode. We'll be back with a new episode next week with further interesting questions and conversation with eminent Indian scientists from across the world. If you have any suggestions, you can visit us on zeroingin.org or write to us on zeroinginpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram or Facebook handles at zeroinginpodcast for the latest updates. Until the next time.